It started with Alyssa Milano and her 85 characters. If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write "Me Too" as a reply to this tweet. We all know what came next. On Twitter and Facebook, in the news media, and in coffee shop conversations, "Me too, me too." Hard to type these words, but me too. Yo también, gam ani, me too, of course, me too. The hashtag was new, but the conversation is old. If a man deceptively seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he must pay a dowry for her to be his wife. This scene from this week's Parsha may be couched in legal language, but let's be clear. What we're reading about is the story of a sexual encounter where the consent and the ethics are murky at best. And yes, hearing these words, it may be our desire or our first instinct to try to read the situation described in the verse generously, to try to rescue or redeem what we suspect or fear has happened. Maybe we want to tell ourselves this man and this woman did both want it. Yet multiple elements of the verse and its biblical context caution us against this read. First, the word used in Hebrew for what the man does to the woman, yifateh, appears elsewhere in Tanakh and almost always carries with it a connotation of deception or malicious seduction. And even more striking, the situation in our verse in Exodus plays out in an unmistakably similar way in the book of Deuteronomy. There, though, the situation is very clearly a violent, malintended rape. That verse begins, "If a man finds a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her, takes hold of her, and lies with her." Our situation in Exodus may not be as clear-cut, but the parallels between these verses help us come to terms with the straight line between this unwanted persuasion and that outright physical sexual violence, and help us take seriously the deceptive seduction in our Parsha. And finally, even if we wanted to read the situation in our Parsha as generously as possible and claim that it is on the more innocuous end of possibility, we can at least admit that the very silencing of the woman's perspective, the way in which the Torah leaves her story out, is in and of itself a form of injustice. If a man deceptively seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, in this verse, we hear the women of antiquity. We imagine our Israelite sisters crying out, "Me too, me too." Armed or burdened with this knowledge, and against the backdrop of what's happening in our world, against the backdrop of our own moral compasses, what are we to do with these verses? These verses and the many others, in fact, the many worse like them, scattered throughout the Torah, that name or describe or legislate about unwanted sexual advances, violence, or rape. How do we approach the essential question of helping women or others who are marginalized, or any of us, feel safe in our sacred texts? Luckily, we are blessed to live in an age in which rabbis, scholars, and interpreters of Torah are drawn to these very questions on these very issues. Teachers who can guide us through the hard work of grappling in a serious way with the parts of our texts and our tradition that feel at odds with our value or ethical intuitions. These contemporary sages offer us ways in to how we can, if not make peace with, then at least actively and productively struggle with these pieces of our sacred inheritance. Our first way in is to confront these texts and name these issues head on. Because reading these texts the way we do, from our sacred scroll, in liturgical settings, and in the presence of our whole community, allows us to use them as testimony. Testimony that is affirmed and validated by none other than God and the Torah herself. Because when we read these stories from our Torah, we can no longer claim that these situations don't exist, that they are fabricated or manipulated. As Rabbi Dini Lewidis writes, "For millennia, our tradition has been a voice of moral accountability, telling and retelling, not concealing, stories of those who've been sexually exploited. There are men who deceptively seduce and lie with women. In contemporary America, it took a Facebook hashtag and a scandal in Hollywood to begin hearing and believing that truth. The Torah has been telling it for centuries." More than just reading these texts, though, a Jewish approach invites us to not take our stories at face value, but instead to insert our own voices and become a part of the process. Rabbi Dr. Amy Kalmanovsky shows us how, making a case for how the religious technology of interpreting sacred texts can be not only intellectually enlightening, but also spiritually restorative. She describes a process of interpretation specifically for victims of sexual violence who encounter these difficult passages. Her approach notices that at face value, our biblical texts, like the legal account in our Parsha, often read like initial trauma stories, devoid of the emotional experience of the woman being violated. As part of her healing process, then, a sexually violated woman can encounter these texts and fill in those gaps, drawing on her own story, but with the safety and buffer of a narrative that is not wholly her own. This midrashic technique, inserting the imagined voices of nameless biblical women, may not make these texts or experiences inherently sacred, but it can, in Dr. Kalmanovsky's words, use our texts and stories for the sacred work of healing. Importantly, this sort of interpretation can serve another purpose. It can insert into not only Jewish text, but also into the chain of Jewish tradition, the voices and experiences that have historically been silenced. In the Gemara, we witness an early attempt on behalf of the sages to bring in the words and perspectives of victimized women. In a heartbreaking passage, the Talmudic rabbis try to imagine, what is the exact nature of the tsa'ar, the pain the Mishnah describes when legislating recompense for rape? In their answers, these men bring stories of women they know who have spoken about their first sexual encounter. Abaye, for one example, recalls his nursemaid, who relates it to hot water on a bald head. Rava, for another, shares Rav Chisa's daughter's comparison to picking off a scab. Studying this text now, we may feel shocked or even offended by this conversation, in which men discuss amongst themselves the intimate sexual experiences of women they know and love. Yet as Rabbi Dr. Judith Hauptman points out, these rabbis were at least attempting, at least beginning the process of incorporating women's voices into conversations about and affecting their lives. Today, our own methods of interpretation can continue this legacy in a much deeper and richer way. Today, it is possible, for example, for a female rabbinical student to build an entire senior sermon off of insights and scholarship by other women. In doing so, in interpreting the Torah with the words and stories of the people whose reality it depicts, in bringing in the experiences and truths of those whose voices have not typically been part of our canon, we model something essential. We live out the necessity of opening our ears, opening our minds, and opening our hearts to the people in our lived communities who we have dismissed or silenced for too long. Them too, we say together. Us too. Reading these texts, giving them a platform, giving them authority, that's important. Interpreting these passages, reclaiming them through the lenses of those who've experienced violence or victimization, that's essential. But perhaps sitting here, millennia after we first inherited our Torah in all of its fullness, we may feel that reading and interpreting these passages as they are is just not enough. Perhaps instead, these approaches need to be the foundation, need to be the jumping off points for evolving and enduring change through updating and amending our Torah for our own time and place. This is a call to action as ancient as our tradition itself. The sages of the Talmud were already legislating corrections to the injustices they perceived. In response to our verse, Dr. Hauptman points out that the rabbis of the Gemara rejected the Torah's description of a crime against the woman's father and reframed it as a crime against the woman herself. They freed this woman from the inevitability of marrying her aggressor, and they reimagined the penalties for this crime. Maybe we can say in retrospect, they didn't go far enough. But like us today, the rabbis of the Talmud were inheritors of a text and tradition that didn't always live up to their own moral expectations and intuitions. And rather than passively accept that, they did something about it. So like the rabbis of the Talmud, we today must adapt and amend our laws and our practices to move the needle, to bend that arc a little closer toward justice. Like our predecessors, we too can and must acknowledge the painful and dark corners of our texts and our societies, and not only encounter them, but correct them. This task is an urgent one. The pain of the women the Torah describes, women who have been approached or seduced or laid with against their will, that pain is overwhelming. That pain is real and it lives in our communities. It lives in this community, in the women and men who say "me too." And in the face of that crushing realization, in the face of such lived horror and trauma, it may feel painfully or even repulsively out of touch to retreat to our Batei Midrash, our rooms of study or worship, and open up an ancient book. And yet, it is this very book and the way we struggle with it despite the pain that gives us the tools and the strength to encounter and counter the pain we see in the faces of those we know and love. Because what we do with our text, reading it, inserting silenced voices, and updating and amending it, that is just what we need to do in our lived communities. Seeking out and believing the testimonials of victims, bringing in the voices of the marginalized, and improving the system that allowed the injustice to happen. All as part of our effort and our obligation to bring about the change that's needed, so that the Torah of our lives and our communities can truly be a sacred one, supportive and safe for all who cling to it. Kaddish Rabbanan. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemeh Rabbah, B'yama divra kiruteh v'yamlich malchuteh, B'chayachon uv'yomachon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, B'agala v'zman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shemeh Rabbah mevarach le'alam olmei almaya. Yitzbarach v'yishtabach v'yitzpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal shemeh d'kudasha berichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush b'chata v'nechamata, damiran be'alma v'imru amen. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Talmidei v'al kol Talmidei hon, v'al kol manda oskin ba'araita, di v'atra hadain v'di v'chol atar v'atar, Yehei lachon u'lachon shlomar rabba, china v'chisa v'rachamin, v'chayin arichinu mezana revicha, u'forkana mikodam avahan divi shemaya v'imru amen. Yehei shlomar rabba min shemaya, v'chaim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'mromav, hu barachamav ya'asei shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen.